Would you believe me if I told you that this sponge will completely change the way you dry brush your miniatures? Now, I don't expect you to, but if you give me the chance to explain, I will gladly tell you why and share a couple techniques that you can start using today. It's helped me produce beautiful metal finishes like this, stone textures like this pillar, Dante's gold armor, and even slapchop High Martial Helbrecht, which technically should be heresy. I forgot to mention, it also solves a lot of issues beginners may have when attempting to dry brush. If you're not sure what I'm referring to, does chalky residue, clogged bristles, or your paint drying too fast sound familiar? Don't worry, they will be a thing of the past once you harness the power of the Relic. Just as a quick backstory on how I came across the idea, which I take no credit for, when I first started this hobby, like most of us, I ended up down the YouTube rabbit hole. I had come across dry brushing and slapchop, which were both promoted as beginner-friendly techniques. One thing that stood out was that a lot of the videos had demonstrated wicking off the excess paint onto a paper towel, which in hindsight caused a lot of my dry brushing issues. I then came across dry brushing videos where Byron from Artist Opus demonstrated using a texture palette, and I noticed a little sponge where he would periodically dab his brush on. Based off of the quality of his work, I felt that this little sponge was the game changer that I needed to prevent a lot of the issues I had when I was dry brushing. This was where I decided to substitute that little sponge with a larger dish sponge, and a lot of experimentation came from that. Now, one does not simply set up the Relic. First, we have to make sure that the sponge has been rinsed and is damp, but not soaked. And if you're wondering how damp it should be, just take a look at my glove and pay attention to the moisture that was left behind. The reason we want it damp and not soaked is because every time you press your brush into the sponge, you don't want to flood the bristles with water. Thus, our dry brush is no longer dry. Now that the sponge is set, wick your dry brush back and forth across a flat surface. The reason I do this is because I've found it helps clear out any dust, lint, or debris that may be hiding in the bristles. You can then wick the brush either on your skin or a glove until you see no moisture coming off. Disclaimer, if you skip this step, you may end up like me and find a random pet hair stuck to your mini after you applied the paint. At this point, you can load up your brush with paint and wick off the excess on a dry palette similar to this. If you don't have one, you can either prime a piece of cardboard or use some old sprues glued to the cardboard and create your own. The one I have here is just made of MDF that was laser engraved. Before you ask me about using paper towel to wick off the paint, the reason I don't recommend using it is because I found you're more prone to picking up dust particle or debris when wicking off excess paint. I've also found that it dries my paint out a bit faster, thus giving me less working time. The paper towel does have its uses. It's actually phenomenal when you go to switch colors and I want to validate the pigment transfer so I'm not mixing the colors or anything of that nature. And more importantly, please take my recommendations as something you can add to your skill set. However, do not feel the need to change the way you paint if you already have success with your current workflow. So, first major issue I encountered when I first started was that the paint appeared to be drying too fast or barely coming off onto the model. You can dab your brush into the sponge a few times. This should reactivate the paint at least once during your paint session. I always recommend testing on either your glove, skin, or a palette before applying it to the mini. Once you see the paint is coming off, that's your green light to continue. What this technique does for us is it gives us a bit more working time with our brush and makes it feel like we're not wasting as much paint. This also can help prevent some of the chalky texture and residue that we get when transferring to the model. However, I would be cautious attempting to reactivate the paint multiple times. You should only reactivate 1 to 2 times depending on how much paint you initially loaded into the brush. So this brings us to our second issue. How can we stop our bristles from getting clogged with paint and use the Relic to not only prevent this, but also help us easily switch colors during a dry brushing session, specifically without having to completely wash the brush? So let's say as we continue dry brushing, we notice our bristles start to clog up. You'll notice that they're bunched up together and your consistency isn't as smooth on your miniature. And this also makes switching colors a massive issue. Luckily, both of these are extremely easy to fix. During your painting session, if you see very little paint transfer or chalky residue coming off, especially with light colors like white, pink, yellow, just to name a few, I would recommend you periodically wick your brush on the sponge. What you should see is any residual paint transfer to the sponge, and your paint bristles should start to return to the original color. But it doesn't have to be perfect. Some pigments can also stain the bristles, so keep that in mind. If you're worried about unnecessary paint mix or transfer, just test on your glove or texture palette. If you don't see any color or paint, then you're good. What you're really looking for are that the bristles themselves will be more evenly distributed and feel like an actual brush when wicked against your skin. Once you're happy with the result, feel free to load the brush back up with paint. What's awesome is when it comes to switching colors, the process is almost identical. The only difference is you will have to add one more step. This is where we flip the sponge to its side and use the cleaner portion to give it a final pass to catch any leftover paint and residue. If you're working within a similar range, say for example, like all of these greens, switching colors isn't that big of a deal. It does become a problem when we start changing to specific hues, right? So if I go from green to say something like orange. Not only does this technique help during this session, but it also makes cleanup at the end way easier. Also, before I forget, and this is very important, I recommend using separate sponges for metallics and standard acrylics. Metallic pigments can linger and cause unwanted transfer later. Now, before we get into the next technique, I just wanted to let you know that we have additional resources and guides coming to our website. We also have an active Discord community packed with painters from all over the world. You can post your completed minis, create progress journals, ask for feedback, and learn some cool tricks. Both links are in the description, and we'd love to see what you're working on. Other than traditional dry brushing, what else could we use the Relic for with our miniature painting applications? Well, if we go back to the technique we used for reactivating paint, you can use the same approach when stippling, adding texture, and building layers. And this isn't just for dry brushes. You can use makeup sponges and foam as well. In this example, I'll showcase the makeup sponge, and yet again, all we're doing is reactivating the paint at least once. Take a look at this cape. As you start to see less paint come off, I dab the makeup sponge, which essentially hydrates the paint in the sponge itself, then keep working. This lets me slowly build layers and add unique textures, especially on surfaces like capes, tabards, armor, terrain, and really anything you want to give some character to. My advice, don't be afraid to experiment, because that's where most of the awesome techniques you'll learn will come from. What about maintenance of the Relic? My next question to you is the Relic reusable? And what can you do to clean it? Just like any other dish sponge, you're going to soak it with soap and hot water, squeeze it a couple times, then rinse with cold water. Let it sit out and dry, and once you're ready to start using it for your next painting session, just add water again. This one that you see here, I've been using for well over a year, and it continues to get the job done. However, it has seen better days. Now, my final question to you is, have you ever dealt with some of these dry brushing issues? And what techniques have you leveraged or developed to combat them? We'd love to hear your thoughts, experiences, and critiques. Also, if you found this video helpful, we have plenty more to come, and make sure you're subscribed if you want to stay in the loop. But no pressure, we're just glad you're here.